I'm just a grandmother. I bake cookies, I knit sweaters, I remember birthdays, and I cry quietly at night, so nobody has to know. But this story is not one I ever thought I'd tell. It's not sweet or heartwarming or stitched together in golden thread like those fairy tales I used to read to my grandkids. No. This story is dark. This story is about pain, silence, and betrayal, the kind that cuts deeper when it comes from your own flesh and blood. The day they took my medicine was the day I realized I had become invisible to the people I loved most. I wish I were exaggerating. I wish this was just a bad dream I'd wake up from sitting in my favorite chair by the window. Sunlight dancing on the walls, the laughter of my grandchildren echoing through the house. But no, this was real. They didn't just forget me. They watched me suffer. And they did nothing. It started small, little things that people dismiss too easily. A missed doctor's appointment, a delayed refill. "We're too busy today, Grandma. We'll get to it tomorrow, Ma." But tomorrow never came. Not when you're old and weak and can't drive anymore. Not when your joints scream at you, when your breath gets shorter and your hands tremble just lifting a spoon. I tried not to complain. I never was the type. I was taught to endure, to hold things in. My generation was raised with silence in our bones and sacrifice in our blood. We cooked, we cleaned, we waited. We loved without question, gave without keeping score. But they kept score. Oh, how they did. My daughter, whom I had nursed through fevers, heartbreaks, and insecurities, she barely looked at me anymore. My son-in-law, who once promised he'd treat me like his own mother, barely spoke a word when I entered the room. The grandchildren glued to their screens. I had become part of the furniture present, but no longer necessary. I kept my pills in a little floral box. One for the blood pressure, one for the joints, one for the chest pain that came like clockwork every evening. They were small round tokens of survival, my lifeline. And then one day they were gone. I asked softly at first. "Did someone move my pills?" I shuffled around the house, lifting cushions, peeking into drawers. My daughter rolled her eyes. "Mom, stop being dramatic. They're probably around somewhere." But they weren't. And I knew it. That night, I didn't sleep. The pain crept up like ivy wrapping around my ribs, choking my breath. I whispered to myself in the dark, praying the pain would pass. It didn't. The next morning I asked again. "I need to go to the pharmacy. Please." My daughter didn't even look up from her phone. "You're just getting dependent on those things. Maybe it's time you toughen up a bit." Toughen up? I wanted to scream, but all I did was nod. What else could I do? I wasn't just a grandmother anymore. I was a prisoner in my own body, trapped in a house full of people who saw me as a burden, not a blessing. They didn't need to raise their voices or lift their hands. They had found a quieter weapon: neglect. And neglect? Oh, it hurts just as bad. But something was changing in me. The pain in my body was one thing, but the ache in my soul, that was something I couldn't ignore anymore. I started to write down everything. In a little leather notebook I kept hidden beneath the cushion of my chair. Every missed dose, every cruel word, every moment I felt like a ghost in my own life. You see, I may be old, but I'm not gone. And deep inside, something was waking up, a silent storm gathering in the distance. Because if they thought I would die quietly, they were wrong. This is the story of how I suffered, and then chose to survive. I still remember the mornings when the house was full of life, when my grandchildren would run into my room with messy hair and sleepy smiles, yelling, "Grandma, wake up, pancakes." Back then, I was needed. I was loved. Or at least I thought I was. Now I was just tolerated. It's a terrible thing, you know, when you start questioning whether your presence is a blessing or a burden. The air in the house changed. My daughter Melissa used to call me Mama with such warmth. Now it was just Ma, clipped, cold, impatient. My son-in-law Derek would barely say a word except when he sighed, annoyed whenever I asked for help. My pills stayed missing. The floral box where I kept them sat empty like a cruel joke. And the worst part, they didn't even try to pretend anymore. Melissa once walked by as I sat hunched over the kitchen table, clutching my chest. I looked up, hoping, begging with my eyes. She didn't stop, just kept scrolling on her phone, her coffee in hand. I whispered, "I think I need a doctor." She paused. Then in the flattest voice imaginable, she said, "You'll be fine. Just rest." Just rest. I was slipping away, slowly, quietly, and they were letting me. That night, I sat by the window watching the stars. The pain was unbearable, but the silence was worse. It wasn't the silence in the house, it was the silence in their hearts. The absence of care, of love, of basic human decency. And then I thought back to everything I gave up for this family. I gave Melissa everything: my youth, my energy, my health. I worked 2 jobs when her father left. I skipped meals so she could have seconds. I went without glasses for years because she needed braces. And now she couldn't even take me to the pharmacy. They say betrayal hurts most when it comes from those you love. But I think the deeper truth is this: betrayal hurts when you realize they never saw you the way you saw them. To me, Melissa was my world. To her, I had become expendable. But that night, something shifted. I looked at the empty pill box. I looked at my wrinkled hands, and I realized maybe I had been too quiet for too long. Maybe love wasn't just about sacrifice. Maybe it was time to speak up. The next morning, I called my neighbor Ruth. She was 82, sharp as a tack, and had always said, "When they stop respecting you, honey, it's time to remind them who raised the lions." I told her everything, and for the first time in weeks, I cried. I cried not because I was weak, but because finally I had stopped pretending to be okay. Ruth said, "You come over here, we'll talk, we'll plan." Plan. It sounded ridiculous. I could barely walk. But in that moment, I realized maybe I couldn't fight the way I used to. But I still had one weapon left: my story. And I was going to tell it loudly, truthfully, completely. Because they may have taken my medicine, but they hadn't taken my voice. Not yet. When I shuffled across the street to Ruth's house that chilly morning, I didn't know what I'd find. A plan. Maybe. A friend. Hopefully. But what I found was more than that. It was a spark. She opened the door before I even knocked. "Come in, baby." I put the kettle on. "You need tea and truth." That was Ruth. No time wasted. No pity parties. Just warmth wrapped in grit. I sank into her big armchair like it was a cloud, though my bones still ached from nights without proper rest. My heart still bruised from days without proper care. "You say they've been skipping your meds," she began. "But have they told the doctor? Do they hide the prescriptions?" I nodded. "And you're sure they know how much pain you're in?" Another nod. Ruth looked at me long and hard, then said what I couldn't. "Then it's not neglect, hon. It's abuse." That word. I froze, because once you name it, you can't pretend it's anything else. Ruth leaned in. "You've been their backbone, their safety net, their free babysitter, their emotional punching bag. But now, you're inconvenient. Now you're sick, you need help, and they don't want to give it." Tears welled up again, but I blinked them away. I was done crying in silence. "I don't want revenge," I whispered. "I just want them to see me again." Ruth smiled. "Sweetheart, sometimes the only way people see you is when you stop being invisible." And that's when the idea was born. We made calls. Discreetly. First to a woman Ruth knew who volunteered with elder care advocates. Then to a church outreach group. Then finally to a lawyer. "Just to ask questions," Ruth said. "Information isn't betrayal, it's protection." For the first time in years, I felt like I had options. I wasn't helpless. I had rights. I had proof. I took pictures of my empty pill box, of the bruises on my arm from where I slipped, and no one helped. I recorded snippets of conversations, Melissa telling me to deal with it, Derek muttering how much of a burden I was. "It wasn't pretty," but it was real. And that made it powerful. The next time Melissa told me, "Ma, I don't have time to drive you," I said, "That's okay. I already scheduled transport with the senior outreach van." Her face like I'd slapped her with a Bible. She didn't say a word. But her eyes, they said everything. Power was shifting. Quietly, gently, like a whisper growing into thunder. At Ruth's, we laughed about it later. "You're playing chess now," she grinned. "No more checkers." But deep down, I wasn't smiling. Because I knew this wasn't about games. This was about survival. And no matter how soft my voice sounded, it was now armed with truth. Because when they took my medicine, they thought they'd taken my strength, but they didn't know. The strongest medicine I had was the one they couldn't touch. Hope. And that was just beginning to heal me. The hardest part wasn't the pain. It wasn't even the betrayal. It was the silence that followed. That long, hollow silence after Melissa slammed my bedroom door shut one night and muttered loud enough for me to hear, "She should have died with Dad." At least he didn't need this much. That silence settled in my chest like a stone. I lay in bed that night, aching in places even the strongest pills couldn't reach. My joints screamed. My stomach twisted from skipped medication. But nothing compared to the heartbreak of knowing my own daughter wished me gone. Still, I didn't cry. I just stared at the ceiling and whispered to the dark God, "Give me one more day, one more step forward," because that's what it had come down to. One breath, one whisper, one act of faith at a time. And then something shifted, not in them, in me. That next morning, I didn't wait for Melissa to bring breakfast. I slipped on my worn-out slippers, shuffled to the kitchen, and poured myself cereal. Derek sat there staring at his phone. Didn't even look up. But I didn't need him to. I wasn't there to be seen anymore. I was there to see, to observe, to document. Every missed pill, every insult, every bruise they blamed on old age, every voicemail Ruth helped me leave with the lawyer. It was no longer just my pain. It was evidence. They'd written me off as weak, but I was becoming something else entirely. A witness. You see, when people treat you like a shadow long enough, they forget you can still hear, still think, still remember. Still record. One night, I heard them talking in the kitchen. Melissa said, "We can't keep paying for her meds. She's not even trying." "She doesn't need everything the doctor says," Derek added. "She's exaggerating." They sounded like they were budgeting for groceries, not deciding my fate. So I wrote it all down. The time they told the doctor I refused my meds when it was them hiding them. The time I begged to go to the hospital, and Melissa said, "You'll be fine, just sleep it off." I was their mother, their responsibility. And they treated me like baggage. But here's the thing about baggage. Eventually someone notices when it goes missing. So I started disappearing, not physically, but emotionally. I stopped reacting. I stopped asking. I stopped pleading. I let them dig their hole, and I watched as they ignored the social worker who came by. Watched them roll their eyes when the church lady offered to help. Watched them get sloppy, because they thought I was fading. But what I was really doing, building my case. One day someone would ask what happened, and I would be ready, because I wasn't just a burden anymore. I was a witness to everything they hoped the world would never see. And that was my quiet revenge. They didn't know what real pain was. They thought pain was a broken nail, a missed promotion, a bad night's sleep. They didn't know the kind of pain that wraps itself around your bones like rust. The kind that whispers you're alone, even in a room full of your own blood. That's the pain I lived with. Not just the aching joints or the tight chest when the pills were hidden. It was the pain of being invisible in your own home. Melissa's eyes used to light up when she was little every time I came home from the grocery store with her favorite cookies. Derek used to hug my legs and say, "Don't ever get old, Grandma. I need you forever." Now, they wouldn't even look me in the eye. I became background noise. But let me tell you something. When people ignore your pain long enough, it becomes a weapon. I started using their indifference against them. Ruth, bless her, taught me how to use the recorder on my phone. I tucked it into my cardigan pocket, left it running during breakfast, kept it nearby when they forgot to refill my prescriptions. Every slurred comment, every cruel whisper. Every time Derek laughed and said, "She's too doped up to know what's happening anyway." But I knew everything. And I wasn't numb. I was strategic. They thought they were draining the life out of me, but they were lighting a fire. The more they took away, the more determined I became. And that's when I made a decision. A simple, quiet, private vow to myself. I will survive this. Not just to live, but to tell the story they never thought I'd be strong enough to tell. Because survival isn't just about breath, it's about voice. And even if mine was weak, even if I trembled when I spoke, I still had one. They couldn't take that from me. I started speaking up in small ways. Told the visiting nurse I hadn't received my prescriptions in 3 weeks. Told the woman from church that I hadn't had a hot meal in days. Told the truth one person at a time. And when Ruth came by to check on me and saw the bruises on my arm, she didn't ask for permission. She took action. And the dominoes started to fall. Not all at once, no, but just enough for the cracks to show in the story Melissa and Derek told the world. The story of the forgetful old lady who didn't take care of herself. No.
That story was falling apart.
And the real one, the one full of lies, neglect, and slow, deliberate suffering. That one was finally being heard, because I had made a choice. And once you choose to speak, once you decide to live out loud, no amount of silence can hold you prisoner again. After Ruth saw those bruises and the empty pill bottles, something in the air shifted. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just looked at me with those sharp, steady eyes, the kind of eyes that say, "I believe you," before you even speak. And then she did something no one had done in years. She listened. I told her everything. Slowly, haltingly. My voice cracked like old wood. But I got it out the way Melissa rationed my medication, how Derek mocked me under his breath, how I was denied food and made to sit for hours without water or comfort. "I'm not crazy," I whispered. Ruth didn't flinch. "No," she said softly. "You're not. But what they're doing to you is..." That same week, she contacted Adult Protective Services. I didn't know what to expect. I thought maybe someone would call, ask a few questions, and then move on. That's what always happened when your old people assume your pain is just part of aging. But this time, they sent someone. A woman named Trina showed up at the door. She had a clipboard, a badge, and a heart full of fire. And from the minute she stepped into the house, I could tell she wasn't just checking boxes. She looked me in the eye. She saw me. "Is it okay if I ask you some questions privately?" she asked. Melissa stiffened. She does," Trina interrupted, holding up her hand. "And I wasn't talking to you." For the first time in what felt like years, I was escorted into another room without my daughter hovering behind me. It felt like freedom, like air. And in that little sunlit space, I told my truth again. Trina took notes, asked for details, listened without blinking. When I showed her the audio recordings, proof that I had been refused medication, ridiculed, manipulated, her jaw tightened. "This is abuse," she said plainly. "You don't deserve this." I nodded, but something inside me still trembled. "They're my family," I know, she replied. But sometimes the deepest wounds come from those who were supposed to love us. Within days, more visitors came. A caseworker, a lawyer, a doctor. One by one, they built a circle around me, soft but unbreakable. Melissa and Derek tried to act polite, but it was too late. Their guilt was written all over their faces. Their voices, once full of power and venom, now sounded defensive. Afraid, because for the first time, they weren't in control. And I wasn't a prisoner anymore. I was seen, I was heard. And I was ready to fight, not for revenge, no. For truth, for dignity, for the right to live the rest of my life as more than just a burden. I was reclaiming the narrative, and they were losing the script. 3 days after the last visit from Trina, I sat by the living room window, sunlight warming my knees, watching the mailbox like a hawk. Not because I was expecting a letter, but because Ruth had said something was coming. And then it arrived. A crisp white envelope, stamped and sealed, hand-delivered by a quiet woman in uniform. She didn't say much, just handed it to Melissa with a neutral expression and walked away. Melissa barely glanced at it until she saw the bold black letters. Notice of Emergency Hearing, Elder Abuse and Guardianship Review. Her face drained of color like someone had opened a valve. I watched her eyes flicker from the page to me, and for a moment, there was silence so heavy it pressed down on the furniture, the walls, the very air between us. Derek walked in from the kitchen holding his phone. "What's going on?" She tossed him the letter like it was on fire. "She's trying to ruin us," she spat. But I wasn't trying to ruin them. I was trying to save myself. That evening, neither of them spoke to me. No mocking, no orders, no sighs of exasperation. Just silence. But silence from them didn't mean peace for me. I barely slept that night, lying awake, wondering what court would feel like. I hadn't stepped foot in one since I was a young mother contesting a property line. That was decades ago. Now, I was the property in question, but Ruth was right beside me through every step. She picked me up that morning. She helped me into the courthouse. She held my hand. "You don't need to be afraid of the truth," she whispered. And I wasn't. Not anymore. The hearing room was cold and quiet. Melissa and Derek sat with their attorney, one of those sharp-tongued men in a gray suit who looked like he hadn't smiled in years. But they couldn't argue with the evidence. Audio recordings, doctor's notes, Trina's full report. Photos of my bruises, my weight loss, the pile of unfilled prescriptions. The judge was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but firm. "This court finds that the actions taken against Mrs. Green constitute neglect, manipulation, and willful abuse. Custodial authority is hereby revoked from Melissa and Derek Colton effective immediately." I didn't cry right away. I didn't even breathe. I just looked at Melissa. She didn't meet my eyes. But I met hers, and in that moment, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Not weakness, but strength. Ruth leaned close and whispered, "It's over." But I shook my head. "No," I said, "it's only just beginning." Because I had my voice back, and I wasn't giving it up ever again. When I stepped out of that courtroom, I didn't just walk into sunlight, I walked into a new life. It felt strange at first. Not being controlled. Not having someone dictate what I could eat, when I could sleep, whether I was allowed my own medication. The silence of freedom is different than the silence of oppression. It hums with possibility. Ruth insisted I stay at her place for a while. "Just until you get your footing," she said, handing me tea like I was royalty. She made me soup, ran me warm baths, tucked a blanket around my legs like I mattered. And I did matter. But something inside me kept whispering, "What about the others?" You see, when you've been through something that dark, something so degrading, you start to recognize it in others, in the way an elderly woman flinches when someone speaks too loud, or how a man at the pharmacy pretends he forgot his prescription just to avoid explaining he can't afford it. Pain recognizes pain. One night, Ruth caught me staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. "You're planning something?" she said with a smirk. I nodded. "I want to tell my story." "You just did, in court." "No. I want to tell it where others can hear it." That's how the idea began, small and almost foolish. Who would listen to an old woman talk about abuse, about being robbed of dignity in her own home? But Ruth, she didn't just believe in me, she pushed me. Within a few weeks, she had signed us up for a small local event, Voices of the Forgotten, a public gathering for elder abuse survivors. There'd be maybe 30 people there, max. But to me, it felt like the Super Bowl. The night before, I didn't sleep. I paced, rehearsed, cried. I kept asking, what if I'm not ready? But that little voice, the one that had gone silent for so long, spoke again. You're more than ready. You were born ready. The next day, I stood in front of a microphone in a room no bigger than a school gymnasium. My hands trembled. My knees felt soft. And then I spoke. My name is Esther Green. I'm a grandmother. I gave birth to 2 children. I fed them, clothed them, forgave them, and stayed silent when they turned away. But when they took my medicine and watched me suffer like I didn't matter, I realized something. Silence was no longer an option. A hush fell over the room, and I kept going. I told them everything not as a victim, but as a survivor. When I finished, there was no applause at first, just stillness. And then tears, clapping. A few stood, one by one. And something incredible happened. People came up to me, hugged me, told me their stories. I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't invisible. That night, Ruth said something I'll never forget. You turned your suffering into someone else's survival. And I smiled for the first time in years, from deep inside my soul. Because I knew my story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The morning after my first public speech, I awoke not to fear, not to dread, but to purpose. It was a quiet purpose. It didn't shout or demand attention. But it sat in my chest like a new heartbeat. Constant, steady, alive. I was no longer the woman who watched her pills disappear while her body ached in silence. I was no longer the grandmother who shrunk into corners, hoping not to be a burden. Now I was something else entirely, a voice. I started volunteering at the local senior center twice a week. At first, I just served tea-folded bingo cards, helped others cross the room. But eventually, word spread about what I'd survived, about the courtroom, about the speech. People began pulling me aside with whispers. My son controls all my money. I don't even know how much my pension is. My daughter keeps forgetting my doctor's appointments. Last week, I fell in the kitchen. My granddaughter hides my glasses, says I don't need to read. Each whisper cracked my heart a little more. There were so many of us. I couldn't save everyone, but I could do one thing they needed to know. They weren't crazy, or weak, or wrong. So I listened. I held hands. I connected people to resources, legal help, elder protection groups. And I told my story again, this time at libraries, community halls, even a nursing school. Each time my voice grew stronger. Not louder necessarily, but deeper, rooted. Ruth said, "You're not just healing yourself, Esther. You're healing others by letting them see you scarred and standing." One night, as we sat watching the sun melt into the trees outside her kitchen window, I said, I used to think survival was the end of the story. She raised an eyebrow. And now I know survival is the start of a revolution. She grinned. Then let's burn it all down with truth and light. We laughed. And for a moment, I forgot all the years I lost. Because here in this moment, I was whole again. Not because I was unbroken, but because I was finally being seen. 2 weeks after the town paper published my story, someone knocked at my door. It was late afternoon, and I was finishing a pot of chamomile tea. The kind I used to drink alone in the dark, wondering if anyone remembered I was alive. I opened the door, expecting Ruth or maybe the neighbor's son. But it wasn't either of them. It was Sarah, my granddaughter. She looked older. Not in years, but in regret. She stood there clutching a bouquet of cheap gas station flowers, like they might protect her from what she had done. "Hi, Grandma." Her voice was small, unsure. "Can I come in?" I didn't answer. I just stepped aside. She sat at the table, hands shaking, eyes darting everywhere except toward mine. I read everything she whispered. The article, your speech, even that comment you left online about elder abuse. My silence weighed heavy in the room. I didn't know. I didn't understand what was happening back then. I set the tea down in front of her, still warm. "You were there," I said. "When they started locking up my meds, when they called me dramatic. You watched me waste away." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I thought they were helping you. That you were just old." There it was again, that word, old. Used like a sentence, a diagnosis, a reason to ignore, diminish, disappear someone. "I was never just old," I said, voice trembling with quiet steel. "I was hurting, and no one cared to ask why." She sobbed, full and unfiltered. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I was scared to believe you. It felt easier to go along with Mom and Uncle Dave. And now," she looked up, "now I see you. I see what we did. And I want to make it right." I studied her for a long moment. "Then start by listening. Not to defend yourself, but to understand the silence you left me in." She nodded. That day, we didn't heal everything, but something shifted. A bridge, damaged and splintered, found its first stone again. She helped with dishes. She hugged me twice before leaving. And as the door closed behind her, I sat down in the same chair I once used to cry from pain. And for the first time in years, I smiled after a knock at the door.
They didn't expect it.
Not the letter. Not the investigation. Not the questions from people in suits who knew how to read silence. 3 weeks after my speech, the authorities paid my former caregivers a visit my family. My blood, the ones who left me cold and medicated into oblivion. And finally, they were the ones who had to answer.
I didn't want revenge. That was never my goal.
But I wanted truth, and truth came dressed in law. Reports were filed. Medical records reviewed. My statements matched up with evidence, unfilled prescriptions, withdrawal symptoms, bruises never explained the neighbor who once knocked and was turned away when I was sleeping too much. They had nothing to stand on. The daughter who once smirked while hiding my medicine. She now had to sit across from people who knew what gaslighting and elder neglect looked like. No more pretending. No more fake smiles. And for once, I didn't have to fight alone. The investigators had compassion in their eyes. They saw me not as a confused old woman, but as a survivor. They asked if I wanted to press charges. I paused. What I wanted wasn't handcuffs. It was accountability. I want them to know they didn't win, I said. I want them to live with the truth. I want them to explain their choices every time someone asks why mom isn't in their lives anymore. Instead of jail, I requested a public acknowledgement, a statement, community service in elder care, financial restitution for what was stolen from my medical care. They agreed because the alternative was worse. My daughter, the one who watched me suffer. She sent a letter, a single page. I'm sorry you felt hurt. Not I'm sorry I hurt you. But that was enough. Enough to show me who she truly was. Enough to remind me that forgiveness doesn't mean reunion. I moved forward. With strangers who became family. With strength I had built brick by brick after every pill they took and every tear I swallowed. And I kept speaking. At centers, at schools, even in churches. Because this story wasn't just about suffering anymore. It was about rising. I was sitting by the community garden one afternoon, soaking in the sunlight. I once thought I'd never feel again when a soft voice said, "Excuse me, are you the lady who gave that talk last week?" I turned. It was a young woman, maybe in her early 30s, holding a notebook and a look of deep curiosity. I watched the video online, she continued. You spoke about being ignored, forgotten, and manipulated. It reminded me of my grandmother. She sat beside me. For the next hour, she told me stories of how she hadn't visited her grandmother in months, how her mother always said she was too confused to care, and how guilt had grown in her like a vine wrapping around her chest. I didn't realize she whispered, tears trembling in her eyes, how easily we abandon those we claim to love. That day, I realized something profound. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a mirror. For every person who watched their grandmother fade in silence. For every son or daughter, too distracted, too distant, too dismissive. My suffering had cracked open doors of awareness. And that young woman, she became one of my greatest joys. She started volunteering at the center. She brought her friends. Together, they organized a program called Second Voices, where elders like me could tell our truths while young people just listened. No judgment, just presence. And that healed me in a way medicine never could. Because what was taken from me, my dignity, my voice, my place in the world, was being returned one listening heart at a time. One day after a session, she turned to me and said, "You're the grandmother I wish I hadn't forgotten." I squeezed her hand. You remembered just in time. It didn't undo what had been done, but it gave the pain purpose, and that, my friend, is sometimes the greatest revenge of all, not to strike back, but to rebuild so brightly that those who broke you can't bear to look away. Word of my story had traveled further than I imagined. Local journalists picked it up. Small podcasts invited me to speak. My story, once just pain I carried alone, had become a message echoing in the hearts of others. And then, the phone rang.
It was my son.
I hadn't heard his voice in almost 2 years. Not since the last time he left my medication out in the rain and blamed me for being too careless to live alone. "Mom," he said, voice trembling. "They're talking about you on the news. They say you gave a speech."
"Yes," I replied calmly. "I did."
"I didn't know you'd gone through all that," he whispered. I sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of his guilt fill the air. Then I said, "You knew. You just didn't care enough to stop it." Silence, then a sob. "I'm sorry. But here's the thing, some wounds bleed long after the knife is removed. And forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting." "I'm not angry anymore," I said, "but I'm also not coming back." He asked if I'd ever visit. I said I had found a new family in people who listened, who cared, who never asked me to shrink for their comfort.
I didn't need revenge in the way people imagine it.
My revenge was in standing tall, clear-eyed, and heard. Later that month, the state began investigating elder neglect in our district. 2 care centers were closed. New rules were written because of one old woman who told the truth with a cracked voice and a full heart. And as I walked out of the council chamber where they honored me for my courage, a small crowd clapped.
Not for my pain, but for my rising.
They took my medicine. They took my peace. But they never took my soul. And now, every step I take is mine. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you. I didn't begin this journey seeking justice. I wasn't even seeking hope. I just wanted to survive one more night without pain, without trembling, without wondering if I mattered at all. But now, I speak not just for myself, but for the thousands of grandmothers, fathers, uncles, neighbors, who are suffering quietly behind closed doors. I speak for the woman whose pills were forgotten again. For the man whose voice trembles when asking for a blanket he never receives. For every elder who gave their life to a family only to be seen as a burden instead of a blessing. To you, I say this. Your worth does not expire. Your value is not measured by youth or productivity. You are still here. You still matter. And to those who've watched someone suffer and done nothing, silence is not innocence. To the caregivers who show kindness, compassion, and patience, you are the quiet heroes. You are the proof that love still grows in even the darkest gardens. As for me, I now volunteer once a week at a local center, reading to women who are too tired to speak. Sometimes we just sit, in silence, in peace. No more theft, no more betrayal. Only dignity, only truth, only healing. So, if you're listening, and you've ever felt discarded, unloved, or unseen, please remember this. You are not alone, and you were never meant to suffer in silence. We rise one trembling voice at a time. Thank you for hearing mine. What would you have done if it had been your mother? And if you are that mother, know this. Your story matters more than they ever let you believe.